Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the broken planks in our hands, but the broken dreams in our hearts. In the harsh marshlands of Norway, Ragna had lost everything that mattered: her sons to war, her husband to time, and now her home to the merciless storms. The widow worked alone, her weathered hands struggling with splintered wood that seemed to mock her efforts. Most people walked past her daily struggle, too busy with their own lives to notice her pain. But when Torleif the Giant saw her that morning, something deep inside him stirred. This massive warrior had just returned from successful raids across the seas, his wagon heavy with gold and treasures. That evening, he came back with something unexpected. He brought seasoned timber, iron nails, warm furs, and proper tools. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He knelt down beside her in the mud and picked up a hammer. Day after day they worked together, building not just a house, but something neither of them expected. What made this legendary warrior stay when everyone else walked away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the marshlands like the memories that refused to leave Ragna's mind. She stood at the edge of what had once been her home, surveying the wreckage that 3 days of relentless storms had left behind. The wooden beams that her husband Bjorn had carefully selected and shaped with his own hands now lay scattered like fallen warriors on a battlefield she couldn't escape. Ragna's calloused fingers traced the grain of a splintered board, remembering how Bjorn had smiled when he'd first brought it home 23 summers ago. "This oak will outlast us both," he had promised, his beard still more brown than grey, his shoulders still broad enough to carry the world. Now both the oak and the man who had shaped it were broken, and she stood alone among the ruins. The marshlands stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of reedy water and uncertain ground that most folk avoided. Here, where the solid earth gave way to shifting mud and hidden channels, only the most desperate or the most stubborn chose to make their homes. Ragna had been both, once. When she and Bjorn had first claimed this plot of land, they had seen promise where others saw only hardship. The fishing was good when you knew the waters, the soil rich enough for a small garden when you understood its moods, and the isolation a blessing when you craved peace. But peace, she had learned, was as fragile as morning frost. Her sons had grown strong in this place. Eric, the eldest, had inherited his father's way with wood and iron, his hands steady and sure whether he held an axe or a hammer. Magnus, 2 winters younger, possessed a restless spirit that drove him to explore every hidden channel and secret path the marshlands offered. Both boys had stood taller than their mother by their 15th summers, their voices deep and their laughter rich as they worked beside their father, learning the ancient ways of their people. The war had taken them both in the same season. Word had come from the Jarl's Hall that warriors were needed for a great expedition to the southern lands, where Byzantine gold flowed like water and glory waited for those brave enough to seize it. Eric had volunteered immediately, his young man's pride burning bright at the chance to prove himself worthy of the family name. Magnus had followed as he always did, unwilling to let his brother face danger alone. Neither had returned. The messenger who brought news of their deaths had been kind, speaking of their courage and the honor they had brought to their family's name. Eric had died defending a fortress wall, his sword in his hand and his battle cry on his lips. Magnus had fallen beside him, refusing to abandon his brother even as the enemy closed in around them. They were buried together in foreign soil, beneath stones that bore their names in runes their mother would never see. Bjorn had never recovered from the loss. The man who had built their home with such hope had watched it become a monument to grief. His hands, once so skilled at shaping wood and stone, had begun to shake. His appetite disappeared, and with it the strength that had made him a respected figure in the scattered community of marsh dwellers. He had lasted 2 more winters before joining his sons in the great hall of the gods, leaving Ragna alone with memories that felt heavier than stone. Now 3 years after burying her husband beside the small grove of birch trees he had planted when the boys were born, Ragna faced a choice that seemed to have no good answer. The storm had destroyed not just her home, but her last connection to the life she had built with such careful love. The broken planks scattered around her feet represented more than shelter. They were the physical remnants of dreams that had once seemed as solid as the earth itself. The nearest village lay a full day's walk through treacherous marsh paths, but even there, what welcome would she find? A widow past her 40th winter, with no sons to speak for her and no husband to provide protection, would be seen as a burden rather than a blessing. She had her skills. She could weave and cook, tend wounds and brew healing draughts from the herbs that grew wild in the wetlands, but these abilities, valuable as they might be, would not earn her a place by any hearth but her own. Starting over meant gathering these scattered pieces of her past and somehow fashioning them into a future she could barely imagine. The wood was damaged, but not beyond saving. She had learned enough from watching Bjorn work to know which pieces could be salvaged and which would serve only as kindling. The stone foundation remained solid, its base sunk deep enough into the stable ground to withstand the storm's fury. She had some tools, though not the fine ones that had been buried with her husband according to custom. Most importantly, she had something that no storm could destroy: the knowledge of how to survive in this unforgiving place. The work would be backbreaking for a woman alone. Each beam would need to be moved by hand, positioned carefully and secured with whatever nails and rope she could gather or make. The roof would require not just skill but strength she wasn't certain she possessed. Winter was still months away, but the marshland seasons waited for no one, and she would need solid walls and a weatherproof shelter before the first snows arrived. As she bent to lift one of the smaller planks, testing its weight against her aging shoulders, Ragna caught sight of movement on the distant path. At first, she thought it might be one of her few neighbours, perhaps old Gunnar checking on her welfare, or young Astrid bringing news from the village. But as the figure drew closer, she realized this was no familiar face. The man walking toward her was a giant among mortals, standing head and shoulders above any warrior she had ever seen. His hair, the color of winter wheat, fell in elaborate braids that spoke of careful grooming despite the hardships of travel. His clothes, though practical, bore the subtle signs of quality well-tanned leather, finely woven wool, and the kind of attention to detail that came from having both the means and the knowledge to demand the best. Most telling of all was the way he moved, with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to command, and the unconscious alertness of a man who had survived countless battles. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. Even from a distance, she could see that they were not the eyes of a stranger passing through, but of someone who saw and understood what lay before him. When his gaze fell upon the wreckage of her home, she watched his expression change from casual interest to something deeper, a recognition that spoke of his own acquaintance with loss and the hard work of rebuilding. Torleif, for that was his name, though she did not yet know it, had been travelling for many days, returning from successful ventures in distant lands, where his skill with sword and strategy had earned him both gold and reputation. His ships, anchored in a hidden cove 2 days' march from the marshlands, groaned under the weight of treasure and trade goods that would make him wealthy by any measure. But wealth, he had discovered, was a burden as much as a blessing when you had no one with whom to share it. He had a home of sorts, a great hall built on land, granted by the Jarl in recognition of his service, but it felt more like a monument to emptiness than a true dwelling. Servants kept it clean and warm, but servants were not family. The long table where he took his meals could seat 20 men, but most evenings found him eating alone, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the rafters and the distant sounds of other people's lives. The sight of Ragna working alone among the ruins of her home struck him with unexpected force. Here was someone facing the same fundamental challenge that haunted his own days, the question of how to build something meaningful from whatever pieces remained after loss had taken its toll. Her determination, evident in every careful movement as she sorted through the debris, reminded him of qualities he had almost forgotten he possessed, qualities that had nothing to do with warfare or conquest. As he approached, she straightened and watched him with the cautious dignity of someone who had learned to judge strangers quickly and accurately. Her face, weathered by years of marsh, wind and sun, bore the kind of beauty that comes from strength rather than softness. Her hands, though scarred by work and loss, moved with the economical grace of someone who wasted neither motion nor effort. Most remarkably, her eyes held no plea for pity or help, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had faced hard truths and chosen to endure. "Good morning," Torleif said, his voice carrying the measured courtesy of a man who understood that strangers in isolated places deserved both respect and caution. "I am Torleif Eriksson, traveling north from the trading settlements. I could not help but notice your situation." Ragna inclined her head slightly, acknowledging both his greeting and his observation without committing to anything more. "I am Ragna, daughter of Olaf, widow of Bjorn the Builder. As you can see, the storms have not been kind to my home." The formality of their introduction carried weight beyond mere politeness. In a world where names and lineages mattered, where a person's worth was often measured by their connections to others, both had chosen to identify themselves through their relationships to the dead. Torleif had named himself through his father, a respected warrior whose reputation added honor to his son's own achievements. Ragna had claimed her identity through both her father and her husband, making it clear that despite her current circumstances, she was no foundling or outcast. "The work looks challenging for one person," Torleif observed, his tone carefully neutral. He had learned in his travels that offering help to strangers required delicacy. Too direct an approach could be seen as insulting, too subtle, and it might not be understood at all. "All worthwhile work is challenging," Ragna replied, setting down the plank she had been examining and turning to face him fully. "But I have time and determination, which often matter more than strength or skill." Something in her response, the quiet dignity, the refusal to present herself as a victim despite her obvious hardships, stirred recognition in Torleif's warrior heart. He had known men who faced impossible odds with this same calm acceptance, who refused to surrender their dignity even when hope seemed lost. Such people were rare, and they deserved respect rather than pity. "That is true wisdom," he said, and meant it. "I wonder if you might spare a few moments to speak with a traveller who has been too long on the road. I carry news from the southern settlements, if such things interest you." The offer was carefully framed as a request for her time rather than an attempt to provide assistance, and Ragna understood both the courtesy and the cleverness behind it. A man of his obvious standing would have little real need for conversation with a marsh widow, but by asking for her time rather than offering his help, he preserved her dignity while opening the possibility of further exchange. "News is always welcome in these remote places," she said, gesturing toward the stone foundation where they might sit comfortably. "And a traveller is always welcome to rest and hear what small news I might have in return." As they settled themselves on the sun-warmed stones, both understood that this simple exchange of courtesies marked the beginning of something neither had anticipated when the day began. The broken planks around them seemed less like symbols of destruction and more like raw materials waiting to be transformed into something new. The conversation that followed their formal introductions moved with the careful rhythm of two people testing the waters of trust. Torleif spoke of his travels through the southern trading ports, where Byzantine merchants offered silk and spices in exchange for amber and furs. He described great cities where stone buildings rose higher than the tallest trees, and harbours filled with ships from lands whose names sounded like music. Ragna shared news of the marshlands, which families had prospered through the harsh winter, whose children had married, and how the fishing grounds had shifted with the changing of the channels. But beneath this polite exchange, Both were taking the measure of the other with the practiced eye of people who had learned that survival often depended on reading character accurately. Torleif noticed how Ragna's hands never stopped moving, even while she spoke, sorting through small pieces of wood, testing joints, making mental calculations about what could be saved. Her knowledge of the marsh country was encyclopedic, revealing a mind that stored and connected details with remarkable precision. Most tellingly, she spoke of her losses without bitterness, acknowledging grief without being consumed by it. Ragna, for her part, observed that this giant of a man possessed a quality rare among warriors, the ability to listen without constantly preparing his own next words. His questions about the marshlands showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness, and his responses to her news revealed a thoughtful understanding of how communities worked. When she mentioned the flooding that had damaged several homes in the lower settlements, he asked practical questions about drainage and soil composition that suggested real experience with such problems. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, painting the wetlands in shades of gold and green, their formal conversation gave way to something more natural. Ragna found herself describing the challenges of maintaining a home in this unforgiving environment, while Torleif shared stories of the engineering marvels he had witnessed in foreign lands. They discovered a shared fascination with the art of building, not just the physical skills involved, but the deeper satisfaction that came from creating something lasting and meaningful. It was during this exchange that the moment arrived which would change everything that followed. A sudden gust of wind, stronger than those that had been rustling the marsh grasses all morning, caught one of the larger broken beams and sent it rolling toward the reed-filled channel that bordered Ragna's property. Without thinking, she lunged forward to catch it before it could splash into the water and be lost forever. The beam was heavier than she had anticipated, and its weight pulled her off balance just as her foot found a patch of loose mud. Time seemed to slow as Ragna felt herself falling toward the rocky edge of the channel, the precious beam still clutched in her arms. In that instant, she understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to be seriously injured, possibly killed, and that all her careful plans for rebuilding would die with her. The irony struck her even as she fell. After surviving the loss of her sons, her husband, and her home, she would be defeated by a piece of the very wood she had hoped to use for reconstruction. But the impact she braced for never came. Torleif moved with the fluid speed that had made him legendary in battle, covering the distance between them in 2 long strides and catching both Ragna and the falling beam before either could strike the unforgiving stones. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, she found herself held against his chest while he absorbed the momentum of her fall with the easy strength of someone accustomed to handling far greater burdens. The rescue itself might have been forgotten as quickly as any moment of crisis resolved, but what happened next transformed a simple act of assistance into something far more significant. As Torleif steadied her on her feet and ensured she was unharmed, Ragna looked up into his eyes and saw something that took her breath away. It was not desire or pity or the calculating interest she had learned to recognize and deflect. Instead, she saw a reflection of her own deepest longing, the need to matter to someone, to be valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was. In that same moment, Torleif found himself staring into eyes that held depths he had not expected. This was not the grateful gaze of someone rescued by a stranger's charity, but the steady regard of someone who understood exactly what had just passed between them. Ragna's expression held acknowledgement of his kindness, yes, but also a recognition that went deeper than gratitude. She saw him not the wealthy warrior or the famous traveler, but the man beneath those roles who carried his own burdens of loneliness and loss. The physical contact lasted only moments, but its emotional impact would endure far longer. When Torleif released her and stepped back, both were changed by the encounter. The careful distance they had maintained during their conversation had been bridged by something neither had sought, but both immediately recognized as precious. "Thank you," Ragna said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. That beam represents more wood than I can afford to lose." "No harm was done," Torleif replied, but his tone carried an undertone that suggested he was not speaking only of the near accident. "Though perhaps it would be wise to move the larger pieces away from the water's edge before the evening winds arrive." The practical suggestion gave them both a reason to remain together without acknowledging the deeper shift that had occurred. Working side by side, they began the process of sorting and securing the scattered lumber, but the nature of their collaboration had fundamentally changed. Where before they had been polite strangers sharing conversation, they now moved with the unconscious coordination of people who trusted each other instinctively. As they worked, Torleif found his hands remembering skills he had not used in years. His father had been a shipwright before war had called him to other duties, and the boy Torleif had spent countless hours learning to judge wood quality, to understand how grain and moisture affected strength, and to visualize the finished structure that could emerge from raw materials. These memories, buried under decades of military campaigns and political maneuvering, surfaced now with surprising clarity. Ragna, watching him work, realized that this was no mere warrior playing at manual labor. His movements showed the confidence of someone who understood both the theory and practice of construction. When he selected pieces of wood, his choices demonstrated an eye for structural integrity that matched her own. When he positioned salvaged beams, he did so with an awareness of load distribution that spoke of genuine knowledge rather than enthusiastic ignorance. "You have built before," she observed, not quite making it a question. "My father taught me the craft before I learned the sword," Torleif admitted. "I had forgotten how much satisfaction there is in creating rather than destroying." This revelation added another layer to the connection growing between them. Here was a warrior who remembered the peaceful arts, a man of violence who valued the work of building and growing. For Ragna, who had spent years surrounded by the evidence of her husband's craftsmanship, this combination of strength and creative skill held a powerful appeal. The afternoon passed swiftly as they worked together, sorting the damaged wood into categories: what could be reused as it was, what would need repair, and what was suitable only for kindling. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they had transformed a scene of chaotic destruction into an organized collection of raw materials. More importantly, they had discovered a rhythm of collaboration that felt as natural as breathing. It was as Torleif prepared to take his leave, duty and propriety demanding that he not impose further on her time, that the moment arrived which would seal both their fates. Standing beside his makeshift pile of traveling gear, looking back at the work they had accomplished together, he found himself reluctant to return to the solitary path that had brought him to this place. "I have a camp established not far from here," he said carefully. "If you would find it helpful, I could return tomorrow to assist with the heavier work." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to name directly. Both understood that accepting would mean acknowledging what had passed between them, while refusing would preserve their independence at the cost of denying a connection that felt both rare and precious. Ragna looked at the work still to be done, then at the man whose unexpected presence had already changed the shape of her day. "That would be most welcome," she said simply. "The work goes faster, with skilled hands to share it." But even as she spoke the practical words, both knew that the real invitation and acceptance had nothing to do with construction, and everything to do with the hope that tomorrow might bring another day of the understanding they had discovered in each other's company. True to his word, Torleif returned the following morning with the first light of dawn, but he did not come empty-handed. Behind him, a sturdy cart creaked under the weight of supplies that made Ragna's breath catch in her throat. Seasoned oak beams lay stacked with mathematical precision, their surfaces smooth and free of the weathering that plagued her salvaged wood. Iron nails gleamed in neat bundles, more than she had seen in one place since her husband's death. Thick ropes, waterproof hides, and even a collection of proper tools completed the load. I thought we might work more efficiently with the right materials, Torleif said, his tone carefully casual as he began unloading the treasures. But his eyes watched Ragna's face closely, measuring her reaction to this unexpected generosity. Ragna stood frozen for a long moment, torn between gratitude and pride. The practical part of her mind calculated the value of what he had brought enough to build not just a house, but a home that would stand firm against any storm the marshlands could summon. Yet accepting such gifts would fundamentally alter the nature of their relationship, transforming her from an independent woman choosing to accept help into someone dependent on his charity. "This is too much," she said finally, her voice steady despite the conflict raging within her. "I cannot repay such generosity." Torleif paused in his unloading, a coil of rope in his hands, and met her gaze directly. "I seek no repayment. Consider it an investment in good craftsmanship. It has been too long since I worked alongside someone who understands the satisfaction of building something meant to last." The distinction was subtle but crucial. By framing his gifts as serving his own needs rather than charity for hers, he offered her a way to accept without sacrificing her dignity. The rope artifact, strong, flexible, designed to bind things together under stress, would become the symbol of how they learned to interweave their lives while maintaining their individual strength. "In that case," Ragna replied after a moment's consideration, "we should begin by planning the foundation properly. The old one served well enough, but I have learned much about drainage since it was built." They spent the morning designing the reconstruction with the careful attention to detail that both found deeply satisfying. Ragna's years of living with the marshlands' moods had taught her which spots stayed solid during the spring floods and where the ground shifted with the seasons. Torleif's travels had exposed him to building techniques from distant lands, methods for creating structures that could flex with changing conditions rather than fighting them. As they worked, their conversation revealed layers of compatibility that went beyond their shared interest in construction. Both possessed the kind of practical intelligence that found solutions in available materials rather than waiting for perfect conditions. Both understood that the difference between temporary shelter and permanent home lay not in size or luxury, but in the quality of thought invested in its creation. Most importantly, both approached the work with the patient persistence of people who had learned that anything worth having required time and effort to achieve properly. The physical labor began in earnest after their planning was complete. Working together, they discovered a rhythm that surprised them both with its natural efficiency. Torleif's strength allowed him to position the heavy beams precisely, while Ragna's knowledge of the local conditions guided their placement for maximum stability. When she pointed out where water might collect during heavy rains, he modified the foundation design to direct flow away from vulnerable joints. When he suggested bracing techniques that would help the structure withstand high winds, she identified local materials that could serve the purpose without requiring expensive purchases. But it was not only their professional compatibility that deepened as the days passed. Small moments of personal connection began to accumulate like sediment in a slow-moving stream. When Ragna prepared the midday meal, she found herself setting two places without conscious thought. When Torleif discovered a bird's nest that would be disturbed by their construction, he consulted her about the best way to relocate it safely. These tiny considerations, insignificant in themselves, created a pattern of mutual respect and care that both recognized as precious. The rope that Torleif had brought proved essential in ways neither had initially anticipated. Its strength allowed them to lift and position beams that would have been impossible for Ragna to handle alone, but its flexibility also enabled techniques that rigid connections could not provide. Under stress, the rope could give without breaking, allowing the entire structure to move slightly rather than cracking under pressure. This quality soon became a metaphor for their developing relationship, strong enough to bear significant weight, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. As they worked side by side, both began to confront feelings they had thought buried beyond recovery. Ragna found herself noticing the careful way Torleif positioned each nail before striking it, the precision that ensured every blow counted. She observed how he tested each joint before moving to the next, never allowing haste to compromise quality. These habits spoke of a character that valued integrity over speed, craftsmanship over mere completion. Torleif, meanwhile, discovered that Ragna's quiet competence extended far beyond her knowledge of marshland conditions. Her hands moved with the sure confidence of someone who had solved countless practical problems through patient observation and careful thought. When unexpected challenges arose, as they inevitably did, she approached them with the calm determination of someone who had learned that most obstacles yielded to persistent effort applied in the right direction. Yet alongside this growing appreciation came complications neither had fully anticipated. The very compatibility that made their work together so satisfying also highlighted the loneliness each had endured in recent years. Ragna found herself looking forward to Torleif's arrival each morning with an intensity that troubled her. The sound of his voice, calling greeting across the marshlands, had become the brightest part of her day, a fact that both warmed and worried her practical heart. Torleif faced his own internal struggles. The simple pleasure of purposeful work, shared with a capable partner, had awakened needs he had convinced himself no longer mattered. His great hall, which had seemed merely empty before, now felt actively hostile in its solitude. The elaborate meals his servants prepared tasted like ash compared to the simple bread and cheese he shared with Ragna during their construction breaks. The rope that connected their work became a symbol of these internal tensions as well. Just as it bore physical weight while remaining flexible, both Ragna and Torleif found themselves carrying the emotional weight of growing attachment while trying to maintain the flexibility that would allow them to step back if necessary. Neither wanted to presume too much or risk the fragile connection they had discovered by pushing too hard for something more permanent. As their first week of collaboration drew to a close, the foundation had been completed and the frame was beginning to take shape. The house that emerged from their joint efforts was unlike anything either had built before, stronger than what Ragna could have managed alone, more thoughtfully designed than the utilitarian structures Torleif had helped construct during his military campaigns. It represented something new, a synthesis of their different strengths and experiences that created possibilities neither had imagined working in isolation. But even as the physical structure grew more solid each day, both struggled with questions that the rope artifact symbolized perfectly. How much weight could their connection bear before something essential broke? How much flexibility was strength, and how much was simply an unwillingness to commit to something permanent? These questions hung between them like morning mist, acknowledged but not yet examined directly as they prepared to enter the next phase of their collaboration. By the second week of their collaboration, the walls of Ragna's new home had begun to rise from the foundation like hopes given physical form. But with this progress came the first serious complications that would test both their partnership and their individual resolve. The morning brought unexpected visitors to the marshland, clearing 3 men from the nearest settlement, their faces bearing the particular mixture of curiosity and disapproval that Ragna had learned to recognize and dread. The leader, a weathered fisherman named Sigurd, whom Ragna knew by reputation more than personal acquaintance, approached their work site with the deliberate steps of someone carrying uncomfortable news. Behind him followed his 2 adult sons, their expressions suggesting they were present more for support than diplomacy. The iron hammer that Torleif had brought from his supplies, a masterwork tool that spoke of serious craftsmanship rather than casual labor, caught Sigurd's attention immediately, and his eyes narrowed with the calculation of a man reassessing what he had expected to find. "Ragna, daughter of Olaf," Sigurd began, his formal address carrying an undertone of reproach, "word has reached our settlement of unusual activities in your homestead. There are concerns about a stranger working among us without proper introduction to the community leaders. The hammer in Torleif's hands stilled as he registered not just the words but the tension behind them. This tool, which had become precious to him for its perfect balance and keen edge, now seemed to represent the delicate nature of his position in this close-knit community. He had been thinking like a traveler offering temporary assistance, but these men saw him as an outsider with unclear intentions, establishing a permanent presence in their territory. Ragna straightened her own hands, finding the rope they had been using to secure the wall joints. The accusation stung precisely because it contained elements of truth she was not yet ready to examine. "Torleif Eriksson has offered assistance with my reconstruction," she said carefully. "His help has been freely given and gratefully accepted." "Assistance is one thing," Sigurd's elder son interjected, his voice carrying the sharp edge of youth, convinced of its own righteousness. "But this looks more like settlement. A man does not bring such tools and materials for a few days' charity work." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. The iron hammer represented far more than casual help. It was the kind of tool a craftsman acquired for permanent use, valuable enough to be passed down through generations. Its presence suggested intentions that went beyond temporary assistance, implications that both Ragna and Torleif had been carefully avoiding in their own conversations. Torleif set the hammer down with deliberate care and stepped forward to address the challenge directly. "I am Torleif Eriksson, son of Eric the shipwright, lately returned from trading ventures in the southern lands. I claim guest right by the ancient laws, and I offer no challenge to any man's property or position in this community." His formal response demonstrated both respect for local customs and subtle warning that he was not without status or protection under traditional law. But even as he spoke the proper words, Torleif realized how inadequate they were to address the real concerns these men carried. Guest right protected a traveler for 3 days, not the weeks he had already spent in the area. "Guest right expires," Sigurd observed grimly, "and guests move on. You speak of travel, but your actions suggest other intentions. What man invests such effort in property that is not his own?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Both Ragna and Torleif understood that their answer would determine not just their immediate situation, but the entire future of their collaboration. The community's suspicions were not unreasonable. A wealthy warrior establishing himself in their remote settlement could represent either opportunity or threat, and they had every right to demand clarity about his intentions. Ragna found herself caught between competing loyalties and desires. Her practical mind recognized the validity of her neighbor's concerns, while her growing attachment to Torleif made her want to defend his presence without reservation. The rope in her hands seemed to embody her dilemma. It connected her to the work they shared, but it could also bind her to consequences she was not prepared to face. "The work is nearly complete," she said finally, seeking middle ground that might satisfy everyone. "When the house is finished, Torleif will continue his journey north. His assistance has been a blessing, but it was always understood to be temporary." Even as she spoke the words, Ragna felt their inadequacy. The statement might address the community's immediate concerns, but it completely ignored the deeper questions that had been growing between her and Torleif with each passing day. By defining their relationship as temporary, she was denying the possibility of something more permanent, a denial that felt like betrayal even as she recognized its necessity. Torleif heard both the explicit meaning of her words and the pain beneath them. She was offering him a graceful exit from a situation that had become complicated beyond either of their original intentions. He could accept her characterization, complete the construction work, and depart with his reputation intact and her position in the community preserved. It was the sensible solution, the one that protected them both from difficult choices and uncertain futures. But as he looked at the partially completed house, their house, though neither had dared to call it that, Torleif realized that sensible solutions were not always the ones worth pursuing. The iron hammer at his feet represented more than a tool. It symbolized the possibility of building something permanent and meaningful. Walking away would preserve his freedom, but it would also abandon the most genuine connection he had found in years of solitary wandering. "The Lady Ragna speaks truly," he said, his formal tone matching the gravity of the moment. "My assistance was offered without expectation of permanent reward. When the construction is complete, I will honor my original travel plans." Sigurd nodded with satisfaction, having achieved the commitment he sought. But as the three visitors prepared to depart, he paused to deliver what might have been warning or advice. "Good craftsmanship deserves to be protected," he said, looking meaningfully at the rising walls. "A woman alone needs neighbors she can trust, and neighbors need to trust those who work among them." After their departure, Ragna and Torleif returned to their labor with a new tension coloring every interaction. The hammer felt heavier in Torleif's hands, weighted with the knowledge that each blow brought them closer to the moment of inevitable separation. The rope seemed less flexible, more like a constraint that bound them to choices neither truly wanted to make. They worked in relative silence through the afternoon, both struggling with the implications of what had been said and promised. The walls continued to rise, but now each completed section felt like a step closer to ending rather than building. The iron hammer that had symbolized their shared craftsmanship now represented the countdown to dissolution. Its every strike, marking time until Torleif would gather his tools and disappear from Ragna's life as suddenly as he had entered it. As evening approached and they prepared to part for another day, both carried the weight of words spoken and unspoken, promises made and possibilities denied. The days that followed the confrontation with Sigurd and his sons carried a different weight than those that had come before. Where once Ragna and Torleif had worked with the easy rhythm of compatible partners, they now moved with the careful precision of people aware that every moment was numbered. The iron hammer continued to ring against nail and wood, but each strike seemed to echo with finality rather than progress. It was during this period of constrained collaboration that the hearthstone arrived, a massive piece of granite that Torleif had somehow procured from a quarry 2 days' travel distant. The stone was perfect for its purpose, flat-surfaced and dense enough to hold heat through the longest winter nights, but its presence raised questions that neither could answer without confronting truths they were not ready to face. "A house needs a proper hearth," Torleif said simply as they surveyed the impressive stone, but his tone carried undertones that suggested meanings beyond mere construction. The hearth was traditionally the heart of any home, the place where families gathered and life's most important moments unfolded. Installing such a permanent feature implied expectations of long use that seemed to contradict his promised departure. Ragna ran her hands over the stone's smooth surface, feeling the quality that spoke of careful selection rather than hasty purchase. This was not the kind of hearthstone a man chose for someone else's temporary comfort, but the kind selected with the understanding that it would serve for generations. Its very perfection forced her to confront questions about Torleif's true intentions and her own deepest desires. "It is beautiful," she admitted, her voice caught between gratitude and uncertainty, "but perhaps too fine for such a simple dwelling." "No hearthstone is too fine for the home of someone who understands its value," Torleif replied, and in those words Ragna heard both compliment and confession. He was not speaking merely of her appreciation for quality craftsmanship, but of something deeper, her capacity to create the kind of home where such a hearthstone could fulfill its true purpose. The installation of the hearthstone required both of them working in the closest physical coordination they had yet attempted. The stone's weight demanded precise timing and absolute trust as they maneuvered it into position using levers and careful leverage. One mistimed movement could result in serious injury, making their collaboration a matter of mutual dependence in its most literal form. As they worked together to position the massive stone, their hands occasionally touched while adjusting ropes or shifting leverage points. These moments of contact, innocent in themselves, carried an electric quality that both recognized but neither acknowledged directly. The hearthstone seemed to absorb not just their physical effort, but their growing awareness of each other as more than working partners. "There," Torleif said as the stone settled into its final position with satisfying solidity. "Now the house truly has a heart." The metaphor was not lost on either of them. In Viking tradition, the hearth represented far more than a source of warmth and cooking fire. It was the spiritual center of the home, the place where ancestors were honored and the future was planned. By installing this hearthstone, they had created something that implied permanence and continuity, values that seemed to mock the temporary nature of their arrangement. That evening, they built their first fire in the new hearth, watching as flames danced across the stone's surface and cast moving shadows on the newly completed walls. The warmth felt different from the outdoor cooking fires they had shared during construction, more intimate, more suggestive of domestic comfort than mere survival necessity. "I have been thinking about what Sigurd said," Ragna spoke finally, her voice barely audible above the fire's crackling. "About neighbors needing to trust those who work among them." Torleif nodded, understanding that she was approaching something important. He spoke from wisdom. Communities survive through knowing who belongs and who does not. But belonging is not always about blood or birthplace, Ragna continued, her eyes fixed on the flames rather than his face. Sometimes it grows from shared work, shared understanding. Sometimes strangers become neighbors through proving their character rather than declaring their lineage. The observation carried weight beyond its surface, meaning Ragna was suggesting that belonging could be earned rather than inherited, that Torleif might find a place in their community through his actions rather than his origins. But she was also testing whether he desired such belonging, whether his assistance sprang from genuine interest in remaining rather than mere charity toward her circumstances. "That is true," Torleif agreed carefully, "but earning belonging requires offering something permanent rather than temporary. It means choosing a place rather than passing through it." They both understood that they were no longer discussing abstract principles of community membership. The hearthstone between them seemed to pulse with warmth that came from more than burning wood. It radiated the possibility of making choices that would fundamentally change both their lives. "The harvest season approaches," Ragna observed, changing direction but not topic. "Those with established homes begin preparing for winter storage, laying in supplies, and making repairs that must be completed before the first snows. It is the time when practical people make practical decisions about where they will spend the dark months." Her words carried invitation and challenge in equal measure. The approaching harvest represented a natural deadline for decisions that could no longer be postponed indefinitely. Either Torleif would depart before winter made travel dangerous, or he would commit to remaining through the challenging months when the marshlands became truly isolated from the outside world. "Winter in the marshlands requires specific knowledge," Torleif acknowledged. "A man accustomed to traveling would need guidance from those who understand local conditions. Such guidance is freely given to those who prove themselves worthy of trust," Ragna replied, her tone suggesting layers of meaning beyond meteorological advice. The fire crackled between them as both contemplated the implications of their careful conversation. The hearthstone seemed to embody their dilemma. It was permanent, valuable, and perfectly suited to its purpose. But its very permanence demanded decisions about the future that neither felt fully prepared to make. Outside, the evening sounds of the marshlands created their familiar symphony, the calling of water birds returning to their roosts, the splash of fish jumping in distant channels, the whisper of wind through reed beds. These sounds had provided the soundtrack to Ragna's solitary life for years, but now they seemed to underscore the choice between returning to isolation or risking the vulnerability that came with deeper connection. As the fire burned lower and the time for parting approached, both Ragna and Torleif understood that they had moved beyond the simple question of completing construction work. The hearth stone, now warming between them, represented a foundation for something more lasting than shelter. It offered the possibility of creating a true home together if they possessed the courage to embrace such a fundamental transformation of their carefully ordered lives. The third week of construction brought unexpected challenges that tested both their practical skills and their emotional resilience. A late summer storm, more violent than any Ragna had seen in recent years, struck without warning and threatened to undo much of their careful work. Rain, driven by howling winds, found every gap in their defenses, while lightning illuminated the marshlands in stark, frightening flashes that revealed the raw power of nature unleashed. But it was not the storm itself that created the deepest complications. It was what the storm revealed about the choices they faced. Huddled together in the partial shelter of their unfinished walls, sharing warmth from a small fire built in the new hearth, both Ragna and Torleif confronted the reality that their time of careful avoidance was drawing to a close. The carved wooden chest that contained Ragna's most precious possessions, letters from her sons, her marriage tokens from Bjorn, and the small treasures that connected her to happier times, had been threatened by the storm's fury, and it was Torleif who had risked the lightning to secure it safely. "These things matter more than any house," he had said as he carried the chest to safety, water streaming from his hair and clothes. "They are what make a dwelling into a home." The chest itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship, carved with interlaced patterns that spoke of both skill and deep affection. Bjorn had made it for their wedding, spending countless evenings by firelight, adding details that turned functional storage into an expression of love. Now, as Ragna opened it to check that its contents had survived the storm unharmed, she found herself explaining its significance to Torleif with a vulnerability that surprised them both. "My husband carved these patterns during our first winter together," she said, her fingers tracing the familiar spirals and knots. "Each design represents something he hoped for our future prosperity, children, long life together. He spent months on it, working in secret so it would surprise me on our first anniversary." Torleif examined the chest with the appreciation of someone who understood both the technical skill and emotional investment such work represented. The patterns were not merely decorative, but symbolic, incorporating traditional motifs that carried deep meaning in their culture. The intertwining spirals represented the joining of two lives, while the protective knots were meant to ward against the forces that might threaten their happiness. He was a man who understood that love requires both patience and skill, Torleif observed, his tone carrying respect for the dead husband he had never met. Such work cannot be hurried, and it improves with careful attention over time. The observation applied to more than woodworking, and both understood the parallel he was drawing. The relationship growing between them had developed with the same patient attention that Bjorn had invested in his carving, carefully, thoughtfully, with respect for the complexity of what they were creating together. As the storm raged outside, Ragna found herself sharing memories she had not spoken aloud since Bjorn's death. She told Torleif about her husband's gentle humor, his way of humming while he worked, and his talent for finding beauty in simple things. Rather than creating jealousy or awkwardness, these stories seemed to deepen Torleif's understanding of who she was and what she had lost. He listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that honoring the past was essential to building any meaningful future. "He sounds like a man who built more than houses," Torleif said when her stories finally wound to a close. "He built a life worth remembering, a love worth treasuring. That is the finest legacy any man can leave." "Yes," Ragna agreed, closing the chest gently. "And now I must decide what to build from what remains." The storm had forced them into an intimacy that weeks of working together had only approached. Sitting close beside the hearth they had built together, sharing warmth and conversation, while the wind howled outside, they could no longer maintain the careful distance that had allowed them to avoid difficult questions. The carved chest between them seemed to embody the complexity of Ragna's situation. It held the treasures of her past, but its presence in this new house raised questions about what future those treasures might serve. Building from remains requires courage, Torleif said quietly. It means accepting that what comes next will be different from what came before, but not necessarily lesser. His words carried the weight of personal experience. Ragna realized that he, too, was building something new from the scattered pieces of a life that had not fulfilled all its early promises. His wealth and reputation could not fill the emptiness of his great hall, just as her determination and skill could not entirely replace what she had lost with Bjorn's death. Different can be frightening, she admitted. There is safety in familiar grief, even when it brings little joy. At least with mourning, you know what to expect each day. But you chose to rebuild, Torleif pointed out. When the storm destroyed your old house, you could have given up, moved to the village, accepted whatever shelter others might offer. Instead, you chose the harder path of creating something new. The observation forced Ragna to confront the deeper motivations behind her reconstruction efforts. She had told herself it was about independence and survival, but perhaps it had always been about something more, the refusal to let loss have the final word, the determination to prove that life could still hold possibilities for growth and joy. As the storm began to subside and the first pale hints of dawn appeared through their unfinished walls, both Ragna and Torleif understood that they had crossed another threshold in their developing relationship. The chest that held her treasured memories had become a bridge rather than a barrier, proof that honoring the past could coexist with embracing new possibilities. "When this house is finished," Torleif said carefully as they prepared to assess the storm damage in full daylight, "it will be strong enough to weather any tempest these marshlands can summon. But its true strength will come not from the materials we have used, but from the understanding that built it." Ragna nodded, recognizing both promise and question in his words. The carved chest that held her past treasures could find a place in this new home, just as her memories of Bjorn could coexist with whatever feelings might develop for Torleif. But making that transition required choosing courage over safety, possibility over certainty. The storm had passed, leaving behind air that felt clean and full of potential. As they stepped outside to survey their work in the strengthening light, both carried the knowledge that they were approaching decisions that would shape not just the completion of a house, but the beginning of whatever came next in their carefully intertwined lives. The arrival of the messenger changed everything in a single moment, transforming what had seemed like a simple story of rebuilding into something far more complex and consequential. The young man appeared on the morning of their 4th week together, his horse lathered with sweat, and his face bearing the grim expression of someone carrying news that could not wait for more convenient timing. He wore the distinctive arm ring that marked him as a servant of the Jarl's Hall, and the sealed parchment he carried bore the formal weight of official business. "Torleif Eriksson," called the giant. The messenger announced formally, "I bear word from Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe. You are summoned to the hall within 3 days to hear matters that concern your inheritance and obligations." The silver arm ring that identified the messenger gleamed in the morning sunlight, its polished surface reflecting a world of political complexities that neither Ragna nor Torleif had discussed during their weeks of domestic collaboration. This artifact represented not just royal authority, but the interconnected web of duties and loyalties that governed the lives of prominent men in their society. Its presence shattered the illusion that Torleif could simply choose his own path without considering the broader implications of his choices. Torleif accepted the message with outward calm, but Ragna could see the tension that immediately settled across his shoulders. "Tell the Jarl that I will attend him as summoned," he replied formally. "I am his loyal servant and will answer whatever call he makes upon my service." After the messenger departed, the silence that fell between them carried a weight that threatened to crush the fragile understanding they had built together. The silver arm ring had brought word that forced both to confront realities they had been avoiding throughout their collaboration. Torleif was not simply a wealthy warrior free to make his own choices. He was a man bound by obligations to powerful figures whose plans might not accommodate his personal desires. "You did not tell me you were sworn to Jarl Magnus," Ragna said finally, her tone carefully neutral despite the turmoil she felt. "That changes many things about your presence here." "I hoped it would not matter," Torleif admitted, his honesty more painful than any deception might have been. "My oath to the Jarl was given years ago in exchange for lands and protection. I had convinced myself that the debt was paid, that I was free to choose my own path." The revelation recontextualized everything Ragna thought she understood about their relationship. A man sworn to the Jarl could not simply disappear into the marshlands to build houses with widows, no matter how much personal satisfaction such work might provide. His obligations extended beyond personal preference to encompass political alliances and military duties that could be called upon at any moment. "What inheritance does the message speak of?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Torleif was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the house they had built together rather than her face. "My father held lands granted by the Jarl's family, estates that have been administered by stewards since his death in battle. If the Jarl speaks of inheritance, it likely means those lands are being formally transferred to my control." The implications struck Ragna like a physical blow. Inherited lands meant responsibilities that could not be abandoned or delegated. A man who controlled estates needed to be present to manage them, to provide leadership for the families who worked the soil, and to fulfill the obligations such holdings carried toward higher authorities. The marshland cottage they had built together would become a charming memory rather than a foundation for the future. "Such lands would require your constant attention," she observed, her practical mind grasping the reality even as her heart rebelled against it. "There would be little time for other pursuits." "Yes," Torleif agreed simply, and in that single word, Ragna heard the death of possibilities they had both been nurturing, but neither had dared to name directly. But the silver arm ring had brought more than just unwelcome news. It had also delivered a revelation that cast their entire relationship in a different light. As they worked together that day, both struggling to maintain their usual rhythm despite the upheaval, additional details emerged that transformed understanding of what had really brought Torleif to her doorstep. "I must tell you something," Torleif said as they paused in their work to share the midday meal. "My presence here was not entirely coincidental. The Jarl's men had been watching the marshlands, seeking information about defensive positions and safe harbors. I was asked to survey the area during my travels." The confession hit Ragna like cold water. "You were spying on us?" "Gathering information," Torleif corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless to her. "The northern borders face increasing pressure from raiders, and the Jarl needs to understand all potential refuges and defensive positions in his territory." The silver arm ring suddenly seemed to glow with sinister meaning. What Ragna had interpreted as chance encounter and growing love had been shaped by political machinations she had never suspected. Torleif's initial approach might have been motivated by duty rather than genuine interest in her welfare. His continued presence could have been part of an extended intelligence-gathering mission rather than personal choice. "How much was duty, and how much was genuine?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain his revelation had caused. "When you chose to help with the construction, when you brought materials and tools, when you shared our meals and conversations, how much was the man, and how much was the agent of the Jarl?" Torleif set down the bread he had been eating, his expression reflecting the same struggle Ragna felt between hurt and understanding. "At first, duty brought me here. I was instructed to learn about the marshlands and their inhabitants. But everything that followed, the choice to return, the decision to help with your house, the feelings I have come to value more than gold, these were entirely my own." The distinction mattered, but it could not undo the fundamental change in how Ragna understood their relationship. The silver arm ring represented more than royal authority. It symbolized the ways in which personal desires could be shaped and constrained by larger forces, how even genuine feelings could grow from circumstances created by political calculation. The Jarl's summons may offer opportunities as well as obligations, Torleif continued, his tone suggesting he had been thinking carefully about possibilities. A man who controls inherited lands also gains political influence. He becomes someone whose voice carries weight in council meetings, whose support might be valued by other powerful families. Ragna understood what he was trying to suggest without saying it directly. Political influence could theoretically be used to protect the marshlands and their inhabitants, to ensure that communities like hers were not simply swept aside by larger strategic considerations. But it could also mean that Torleif would become part of a world where personal relationships were subordinated to political advantage, where even marriage became a tool for advancing family interests rather than personal happiness. The house they had built together stood nearly complete around them, its strong walls and carefully fitted joints representing everything they had learned about working in harmony. But the silver arm ring had introduced complexities that no amount of craftsmanship could resolve. They had created a home that might never be inhabited by those who built it, a symbol of possibilities that political realities might render impossible to fulfill. As evening approached and they prepared to part for what might be one of their final days together, both understood that the Jarl's summons represented more than an interruption of their construction work. It was a test of whether the connection they had discovered could survive the pressures of a world that valued political utility over personal happiness, duty over love. The morning of Torleif's departure dawned grey and mournful, as if the very sky understood the weight of what was being lost. Their final day of work together carried a desperate quality, both of them trying to complete not just the last details of construction, but to somehow capture and preserve everything they had built beyond mere wood and stone. The golden cloak pin that Ragna had discovered among her mother's possessions became the focal point of her internal struggle. A beautiful artifact that represented the possibility of love and status, yet also symbolized the impossibility of bridging the gap between their different worlds. The pin itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship, its golden surface carved with intricate knotwork that caught and reflected light like captured sunlight. It had belonged to her mother, a woman who had married above her station and worn this pin as a symbol of her elevated position in society. Now, as Ragna held it in her calloused hands, she wondered if it might serve a similar purpose, transforming a marsh widow into someone worthy of standing beside a landed nobleman. "Your mother had excellent taste," Torleif observed when she showed him the pin, his voice carrying the appreciation of someone who understood both its artistic value and social significance. "Such pieces are worn only by women of high standing." "She wore it to her wedding," Ragna explained, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns. "My father was a successful merchant, but her family held ancient bloodlines. This pin represented the joining of new wealth with old honor. The parallel was unmistakable. Ragna could offer ancient lineage and genuine nobility of character, while Torleif possessed the political power and material wealth that might elevate them both in society's estimation. The golden cloak pin could serve as a bridge between their different circumstances, proof that such unions had precedent in their culture. But even as they discussed the pin's history and significance, both understood the practical obstacles that no amount of golden jewelry could overcome. Torleif's obligations to the Jarl extended beyond mere land management. He would be expected to marry strategically, forming alliances that strengthened his patron's political position. A connection with a marsh widow, however personally satisfying, offered no political advantages that might justify defying traditional expectations. The Jarl's summons likely includes discussion of marriage prospects, Torleif admitted, as they worked together to install the final shutters on their completed house. Men who inherit significant lands are expected to form alliances that benefit the realm as well as themselves. The honesty was brutal but necessary. Ragna had lived long enough to understand how political marriages functioned. They were treaties negotiated between families rather than unions chosen by individuals. A man in Torleif's position would be presented with candidates whose bloodlines, dowries, or family connections offered strategic value. Personal preference, if it mattered at all, would be secondary to political calculation. "And what will you tell the Jarl about such prospects?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, despite the turmoil she felt. Torleif paused in his work, his hands stilled on the wooden shutter they were hanging. "I will tell him that I have found something in these marshlands that no political alliance could provide: peace, purpose, and the kind of partnership that makes a man better than he was before." The words hung between them like a promise neither dared to fully embrace. They represented everything both wanted to believe possible, yet they seemed fragile against the weight of social expectations and political necessities. The golden cloak pin glinted in Ragna's hand like captured hope, beautiful, but perhaps ultimately powerless against the forces arrayed against them. As the day progressed and their construction work neared completion, both found themselves engaging in a form of desperate arithmetic, calculating possibilities that might allow their connection to survive the coming separation. Perhaps Torleif could fulfill his immediate obligations to the Jarl while maintaining some connection to the marshlands. Perhaps political marriages could be delayed or avoided through clever maneuvering. Perhaps the feelings they had discovered could endure extended separation until circumstances became more favorable. But each possibility they examined revealed new complications. The distance between the Jarl's holdings and the marshlands was significant enough to make regular visits impractical. The demands of managing inherited estates would consume most of Torleif's time and energy, leaving little for personal relationships that offered no political advantages. Most daunting of all, the social gulf between a landed nobleman and a marsh widow was wide enough that bridging it would require sacrifices neither was certain they could make. "I could come with you," Ragna said suddenly, as they paused to admire their completed work. The house stood before them like a monument to what partnership could accomplish: strong, beautiful, and perfectly suited to its purpose. "As your housekeeper or steward, someone to manage domestic affairs while you attend to larger matters." The suggestion carried both hope and heartbreak. It would allow them to remain together while avoiding the scandal of an inappropriate romantic relationship. Yet it would also require Ragna to abandon the independence she had fought so hard to maintain, transforming herself from an equal partner into a subordinate dependent on his continued favor and protection. Torleif considered the proposal with the careful attention it deserved. "You would hate it," he said finally. "Managing a great household requires navigating social complexities that have nothing to do with competence or character. You would be surrounded by people who judged you for your origins rather than your abilities." His rejection was gentle but firm, based on understanding of who she truly was, rather than dismissal of what she offered. The golden cloak pin in her hand seemed to mock her for imagining that jewelry could transform a fundamental mismatch between personal desires and social realities. As afternoon gave way to evening and the time for final partings approached, both Ragna and Torleif found themselves facing questions that had no easy answers. The house they had built together stood as proof of what they could accomplish when their different strengths were combined, but it also highlighted what they would lose when those strengths were separated again. "I want you to keep this," Ragna said, offering him the golden cloak pin with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. "Not as a token of what we could not achieve, but as reminder of what we discovered was possible." Torleif accepted the pin with the reverence it deserved, understanding both the material value of the gift and the deeper meaning it carried. "I will treasure it," he promised, "and perhaps someday circumstances will change in ways that make our impossible dreams possible again." The perhaps carried more weight than certainty, but it also offered more hope than despair. Both understood that they were not abandoning their connection entirely, but acknowledging that its future development would require patience, cleverness, and possibly some intervention from fate itself. As Torleif prepared his travelling gear for an early morning departure, the completed house around them seemed to glow with warm satisfaction. Every joint was tight, every surface smooth, every detail carefully considered and expertly executed. It represented the best of what they could accomplish together, shelter that was also art, function that achieved beauty through perfect attention to purpose. "This house will stand for generations," Torleif said as they performed their final inspection by lamplight. "Anyone who examines its construction will see the care that built it. And perhaps they will understand that such care grows best when two people work together towards something larger than either could achieve alone," Ragna replied, her voice carrying both sadness for what was ending and gratitude for what had been shared. The golden cloak pin now pinned to Torleif's travelling cloak caught the lamplight as he moved, sending small sparkles of reflected gold across the walls they had raised together. It would travel with him to the Jarl's court, a secret reminder of the marshland widow who had taught him that building something meaningful required more than strength or wealth. It required partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision. Outside, the night sounds of the marshlands provided their familiar symphony, unchanged by the human drama that had played out among their reedy channels and hidden waterways. Tomorrow would bring separation and uncertainty, but tonight they could rest in the satisfaction of work completed and connection honored, even if circumstances prevented it from developing as both had hoped. Dawn broke over the marshlands with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the turmoil in both their hearts. Torleif stood fully dressed for travel, his pack secured and his weapons properly arranged. Yet he made no move toward the path that would carry him away from everything he had come to value most. The wedding ring that had belonged to Ragna's mother lay heavy in his palm, not the golden cloak pin she had given him the night before, but a different artifact entirely, one that carried even greater significance and posed an even more profound question. Ragna had offered the ring in the pre-dawn darkness, pressing it into his hands with words that had shaken him to his core. "This was my mother's wedding band," she had said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. She wore it for 37 years, through good seasons and hard ones, through the births of children and the deaths of parents, through everything that makes a life worth living. The silver wedding ring bore the simple elegance of a piece created for daily wear rather than ceremonial display. Its surface showed the gentle wearing that came from a lifetime of use, the kind of patina that spoke of countless meals prepared, children comforted, and hands joined in work and worship. Unlike ornate jewelry designed to impress observers, this ring had been crafted to symbolize something far more precious, the quiet commitment that sustained marriage through all the ordinary moments that actually comprised a life. "Why are you giving me this?" Torleif had asked, though he suspected he understood her meaning. "Because I want you to know that some promises are worth more than convenience or social approval," Ragna had replied. "My parents' marriage began as a political alliance, but it became something deeper through their choice to honor their commitment every day. This ring represents the possibility that love can grow from respect, that partnerships can strengthen rather than weaken under pressure." Now, standing in the morning light with the ring in his palm and his departure long overdue, Torleif faced the most important decision of his life. The Jarl's summons could not be ignored indefinitely. Delay would be interpreted as defiance, possibly rebellion. His inherited lands required immediate attention, and his political obligations demanded prompt fulfillment. Every rational consideration pointed toward the necessity of departing immediately and accepting whatever future the Jarl's plans offered. But the wedding ring represented an alternative that transcended rational calculation. It symbolized the possibility of choosing personal happiness over political advantage, of building something meaningful rather than merely profitable. Holding it, Torleif could envision a different kind of life, one centered on the marshland home they had created together, sustained by the kind of partnership they had discovered through shared work and mutual understanding. "I cannot accept this," he said finally, though his tone suggested internal struggle rather than rejection. "And it should be offered only when he can promise the kind of future that justifies such a commitment." Ragna understood both the propriety and the deeper meaning behind his refusal. He was not rejecting her or the possibility she represented, but acknowledging that circumstances made it impossible for him to offer the security and stability that marriage should provide. A man who faced uncertain political obligations could not ask a woman to bind her future to his until he knew what that future might contain. "Then, take it as a promise from me," she said, closing his fingers around the ring. "A promise that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth the risk of disappointment and loss." The weight of the silver ring seemed to increase as Torleif contemplated its implications. Accepting it would mean carrying both a reminder of what he was leaving behind and a commitment to return if circumstances ever made such return possible. It would transform his departure from an ending into a postponement, his obligations to the Jarl into temporary barriers rather than permanent obstacles. "If I take this," he said carefully, "I am making a promise I may not be able to keep. The Jarl's plans may include arrangements that make return impossible." "Then you will know you tried," Ragna replied, "and I will know that what we built here was real enough to be worth the attempt." The morning sun climbed higher, and still Torleif remained rooted in place, the wedding ring in his hand, representing a choice between two entirely different futures. He could pocket the ring and carry it as a secret talisman, a reminder of possibilities abandoned for duty's sake. Or he could return it to Ragna and depart with clean conscience, accepting that their connection had been meaningful but necessarily temporary. The marshlands stretched around them in all directions, peaceful and eternal, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow supportive of them. The house they had built together stood solid and ready, a testament to what partnership could accomplish when two people committed themselves fully to shared purpose. The ring gleamed in his palm like captured moonlight, beautiful and simple, weighted with the dreams of all who had worn it before and the hopes of those who might wear it in the future. The decision crystallized in the space between one heartbeat and the next, arriving with the sudden clarity that sometimes accompanies life's most important moments. Torleif looked down at the silver wedding ring in his palm. Then, up at Ragna's face, weathered by hardship, but luminous with the kind of beauty that came from strength of character rather than mere youth, and understood with perfect certainty what choice he needed to make. "I will not take your mother's ring," he said, and for a moment Ragna's face began to crumple with disappointment. "Because when I return from the Jarl's court, I want to offer you a ring of my own choosing, properly given, with the full knowledge of what future we can build together." The transformation of her expression from despair to blazing hope was like watching sunrise break through storm clouds. She understood immediately what his words meant, not rejection, but the promise of something better than desperate gestures made in the shadow of forced separation. He was choosing to face his obligations with the intention of clearing them rather than simply enduring them, of creating space in his life for the partnership they both desired. "You mean to return," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I mean to fight for the right to return," Torleif corrected. "The Jarl's summons may bring obligations I cannot refuse, but it may also bring opportunities I have not anticipated. A man who inherits lands also gains political standing, and political standing can sometimes be leveraged to achieve what seemed impossible." The wedding ring that Ragna had offered was carefully returned to her keeping, but its significance had changed entirely. Rather than a desperate token of what they were losing, it had become a symbol of what they aspired to earn. The proper order would be preserved, he would face his duties, she would maintain her independence, and if circumstances allowed, they would come together as equals rather than as refugees from impossible situations. But even as hope blazed between them, both understood that the path forward would require more than good intentions. Torleif's inherited lands came with responsibilities that could not be ignored or delegated entirely. Ragna's position in the marshlands represented independence that she would not surrender lightly. Bridging the gap between their different worlds would require careful planning and considerable patience from both sides. "While you are gone, I will make preparations," Ragna said with the practical determination that Torleif had come to love. "If you return with freedom to choose your own path, I want to be ready to walk it beside you." The promise carried weight beyond mere sentiment. Ragna was committing to use their time apart productively, to develop skills and connections that might allow her to function successfully in his world should circumstances permit their reunion. It was a pledge to grow rather than simply wait, to become the kind of partner who could truly share his life rather than merely hiding in its shadows. Torleif nodded, understanding both the practical wisdom and emotional courage her words represented. "And I will work to create circumstances that make such choices possible." The Jarl values loyalty, but he also respects strength. "If I can prove my worth through managing the inherited lands effectively, I may earn the right to make personal decisions without seeking his approval." The silver wedding ring glinted between them, no longer a symbol of desperate improvisation, but of mature planning and mutual commitment to shared goals. Both understood that achieving their desires would require more than passion. It would demand patience, strategic thinking, and the kind of steady persistence they had already demonstrated in their construction work. As Torleif finally shouldered his pack and prepared to begin the journey that could no longer be delayed, both felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were choosing to fight for a future that remained uncertain, to invest time and effort in possibilities that might ultimately prove impossible to achieve. Yet the alternative, accepting permanent separation without struggle, felt like betrayal of everything they had discovered about themselves and each other. "I will send word when I can," Torleif promised as he prepared to depart. "Letters may travel even when I cannot." "And I will watch for them," Ragna replied. "The marsh roads are treacherous, but they are not impassable to those who know their secrets." The practical arrangements masked deeper emotions, but also provided structure for maintaining connection across distance and time. Letters would carry more than mere news. They would sustain the understanding they had built, allowing it to develop even during physical separation. As Torleif finally began walking toward the path that would carry him away from the marshlands, the silver wedding ring remained with Ragna as a promise rather than a farewell gift. She would keep it safe, along with the hope it represented, until the day when it might be properly offered and joyfully accepted. The house they had built together stood witness to their parting, its strong walls and carefully fitted joints, proof that some things, once properly constructed, could endure whatever storms might come. Like their connection, it had been built to last, designed to weather separation as well as togetherness, strong enough to shelter whatever future their choices might ultimately create. 6 months later, as the first warm winds of spring began to stir the marsh grasses from their winter dormancy, Ragna stood in the doorway of her completed home and watched a familiar figure approaching across the wetlands. The brass key that hung from a leather cord around her neck, a key that Torleif had crafted during the long winter months and sent with his last letter, seemed to grow warm against her chest as recognition dawned. He looked different than when he had departed in autumn, carrying himself with the confident bearing of a man who had successfully navigated political complexities and emerged with both honor and freedom intact. Yet beneath that new authority, she could still see the patient craftsman who had knelt beside her in the mud to rebuild her life, the gentle giant who had understood that some things were worth more than gold or glory. The brass key had arrived 3 weeks earlier, accompanied by a letter that explained everything in careful, hopeful detail. Torleif had indeed inherited his father's lands, but he had also negotiated an arrangement that satisfied both duty and desire. The estates would be managed by capable stewards he had selected and trained, while he maintained overall authority through periodic visits and careful oversight. Most importantly, he had earned the Jarl's grudging respect for his administrative skills and political wisdom, freedom that came with the right to make personal choices without seeking approval for every decision. The lands prosper under thoughtful management rather than constant supervision, his letter had explained, and thoughtful management sometimes requires stepping back to see the larger picture. A man who spends all his time managing details may lose sight of what makes life worth managing. The brass key itself was a masterwork of both function and artistry, shaped to fit the lock of a strong box that would arrive with its bearer. But more than that, it was a symbol of access and invitation, a sign that doors previously closed could be opened when approached with the right combination of patience and determination. Now, watching Torleif approach with a heavy pack and the promised strong box carried carefully in his arms, Ragna felt the culmination of months spent preparing for this moment. She had used their time apart, not simply to wait, but to grow. Her skills in herb lore and healing had been refined through study and practice, making her knowledge valuable to communities far beyond the marshlands. Her understanding of trade and commerce had expanded through careful observation and strategic relationships with merchants who traveled the marsh roads. Most importantly, her confidence in her own worth had deepened through proving to herself that she could thrive independently while still remaining open to partnership. "I bring gifts," Torleif called, as he drew near enough for conversation, his voice carrying both formality and barely contained joy. The strong box he carried was bound with iron and carved with protective symbols, clearly designed to hold treasures of significant value. But Ragna's attention focused on the man rather than his possessions, noting the careful way he moved, the respect in his approach, the obvious effort he had invested in making this return worthy of the hopes they had both carried through the winter months. "Then you are doubly welcome," she replied, stepping aside to invite him into the home they had built together. "The hearth has been kept warm, and there is much to discuss." Inside the house, the familiar comfort of shared space made their reunion feel both natural and momentous. The hearthstone radiated warmth that spoke of fires carefully tended through the cold months, while the carved wooden chest that held Ragna's treasures had been joined by new acquisitions that spoke of a life actively lived rather than passively endured. Most tellingly, the house showed signs of modification and improvement, small changes that demonstrated how she had continued to invest in their shared creation even during his absence. Torleif opened the strong box with careful ceremony, revealing contents that took Ragna's breath away. Gold, yes, but also rare silks, precious stones, and trade goods that spoke of wealth beyond mere survival. More importantly, the box contained legal documents that established his rights and freedoms, proof that his negotiations with the Jarl had achieved everything necessary to make their future possible. "I offer these as bride price," he said formally, "not because you can be purchased, but because your worth deserves acknowledgement in terms that our society understands." But the most precious contents of the strong box were revealed last: a new wedding ring of his own making, crafted from silver and gold, intertwined in patterns that echoed the decorative motifs of their house. Unlike the simple band that had belonged to Ragna's mother, this ring was designed specifically for her, its size and weight carefully calculated, its decorative elements chosen to reflect both her heritage and their shared future. "Will you accept what I offer?" Torleif asked, the formal proposal carrying weight that both legal and personal. "Will you bind your life to mine, knowing that it will require changes from both of us, but trusting that what we build together will be stronger than what either could achieve alone?" Ragna looked at the ring, then at the man who offered it, understanding that she was being asked to make a choice that would transform everything about her life. The brass key around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding her of all the doors that had opened through patience and determination, all the apparently impossible things that had become possible through refusing to accept defeat. "Yes," she said simply, and in that word committed herself to the most important construction project of her life, not the building of a house, but the creation of a marriage that would shelter them both through whatever storms the future might bring. The wedding ring slipped onto her finger with perfect fit, as if it had always belonged there, as if everything in their lives had been leading to this moment of completion and new beginning.